Today, I wanted to talk about how to survive the insane difficulty in Tales of Maj'Eyal. All of this will be applicable to the lower difficulties as well, but it's tailored towards players transitioning from Nightmare to Insane. To illustrate the things I'm talking about, we'll be following along my recent Paladin run on Insane Roguelike. I chose Sun Paladin because, well, I wanted to play it, but also because it's just a fairly straightforward melee class, which I think works better for the purpose of this video, rather than if I just shot things with a wrenched end beam. On some classes and races, you will get a unique starting dungeon, which is great, as it's just some free experience and gold to help you kickstart your character. You shouldn't have any difficulty clearing it, it's a walk in the park. Oh. Okay, so some of these dungeons are actually incredibly difficult, and you definitely should not feel embarrassed to die in them. In all seriousness, if you are careless, on Insane the bosses of a few of these starting dungeons can kill you. The boss in the first dungeon of the Forbidden Cult starting area being another example. To get through these, you need to just leave the mindset of putting a single point into a bunch of talents for a bit, and instead pump your best single target ability and you should be fine. Don't forget that you can always take your last 4 class points back and reinvest them, so you won't be stuck with the talent maxed for the rest of the game. Alright, so in Maj'Eyal, the first dungeon I recommend doing is Trollmire, as it's the easiest zone. You can also kill the optional boss while you're here. If you don't aggro everything at once and avoid getting surrounded, it shouldn't be a problem. If you come across the Troll Hedge Wizard at any point, well, good luck. Once you've cleared this area, congratulations! You can now use your Rod of Recall and go buy the best ability in the game. It's the Movement Infusion. You should try to find one that scales with your primary stats and has around 10 turns of cooldown. Infusions are sold in Derf, this Elven town, the Mage City, and Last Hope. Even if you can't find one for your stats, you should still just buy the best one for now. Let's talk Inscriptions. These are your lifelines, and you should aim to upgrade the 3 starting ones as soon as you have enough gold. I always prioritize the Movement Infusion, and I replace Regeneration or Teleport with it. Here's a quick guide to using the Movement Infusion. Don't. No, I'm serious. Don't use it. It is your last resort. You should never pick a fight while your Movement Infusion is on cooldown. That's not to say that it's not useful for repositioning or closing gaps. It's in fact extremely useful, but you just can't afford to use it like that. Let's look at an example. You are a melee class at 60% life. An annoying Archmage rare just teleported away from you with 20% of its life remaining, and you can definitely kill it if you pop your Movement Infusion and run it down. But oh no, there was a rogue berserker unique in stealth, and your run is now over. Instead, you could have used the Movement Infusion to run back around the corner into the area you've already explored and you know is safe, press your rest button, and wait for the Archmage rare to simply walk around the corner straight into your melee range. Obviously, some classes or races have built-in escape skills, so you can be more liberal with your Movement Infusion, but I personally just never feel safe without it off cooldown. So that's enough about that. What about the other 2 inscriptions? I like running a healing infusion, as it gives you a heal and cleanses poisons and wounds, and a wild infusion that cleanses physical effects, so I can get rid of stuns. As soon as I get a 4th inscription slot, I get another wild for mental effects, so that I can get rid of confusion. I default to this setup on every character, and it works really well. With that said, I recommend you experiment and adapt your inscriptions to your character and playstyle. So, hopefully, you now have your Movement Infusion. Let's get back to the dungeons. I recommend clearing the Ruins of Kor'Pul second, as it's the next easiest zone. Just be wary of your light radius. If it's low, like 4, 5 or less, this makes the dungeon more difficult, as you can get hit by invisible enemies. I encountered my first escort here, so let's talk about them for a bit. Escorts can range from pretty easy to extremely difficult, depending on the enemy spawns and distance to the portal. You don't have much control over any of that. What alleviated a lot of frustration about escorts for me was learning that you can right-click their icons at the top and tell them to wait. Unfortunately, this only lasts a few turns, and then they shout, "We need to hurry," and just run it down the nearest corridor into the welcoming arms of the nearest rare. This is where body blocking comes in. If you stand in the path of the escort, it won't move. Then you wait enough turns so that they again become willing to stand still for a moment, run ahead and clear the next room, only to body block them again, wait, make them stand still, clear the next room, and so on. If you are thinking, well, that's really cheesy, I don't want to do that, I think that's reasonable, but for me, since it's within the game's rules, I classify it as a clever use of game mechanics. Still, no matter how many precautions you take, sometimes the escort can't be saved, and they are definitely not worth dying for, although it's often difficult to stop yourself. Be a little careful about the boss in Kor'Pul. I didn't start recording in time, but you want to just peek at it around the corner and then hide, so it has to come to you, otherwise it can blast you with magic at a long range. Once you're done with Kor'Pul, it's time to head to Derf. If you have enough gold, you can upgrade your other inscriptions, but we're here for the arena quest, which gives you 2 generic points. This should be really easy and can be done even right after Trollmire. Just make sure you do it before level 14 or the quest will disappear. Before we get back into the dungeons, let's talk about gear. A quick disclaimer, I use a few mods while playing the game. Relevantly, I also use a mod that changes item descriptions to be more easily readable if you know what you're looking at. It should be mostly self-explanatory. I just want to point out that the minus next to stun freeze, for example, means stun immunity, cut minus is bleed immunity, knockback minus knockback immunity. You get the idea. If you are not using any mods and you're wondering if you need to get any of these, definitely not. Vanilla works perfectly fine. Mods are just a way to fine-tune your experience once you know what to look for. Also on weapons, you might notice I don't have damage numbers, but instead just a percentage. This is not the mod, it's an option called Advanced Weapon Statistics, and I personally find it way less confusing to judge weapons this way, but your mileage may vary. Let's get back to the video. For weapons, you generally just want to equip the one with the most damage, but what about the rest? For the early game, increases to maximum health are king. I found these absolutely insane boots in Trollmire, plus 100 HP is nuts this early. The of health lanterns are another good source of some HP, and you can check the shop in Derf, which sometimes sells one. I also use this mighty girdle, for example, for all the tier 1 dungeons, primarily for the life. Wherever you can't get HP, you should prioritize immunities. Stun is the most important, closely followed by confusion. You won't be able to hit 100% immunity for a while, but even a little bit can help. Obviously, these are just the general guidelines, and at times you might want to prioritize different things. Again, experiment, it will help you understand the game better in the long run. Alright, so we're done with Trollmire and Kor'Pul. Is it time for tier 2 dungeons yet? Definitely not. The game will eventually try and tempt you to skip floors to get straight to the boss, but I highly recommend full clearing every tier 1 dungeon. This will give you some more XP, which is good, even though zones scale with your level. The more talents you have, the more options you have to outplay the AI, which just brainlessly runs at you. It will also let you hopefully find some decent gear for every slot. I find Norgus Lair, Caves and Reloran Camp to be pretty interchangeable in terms of difficulty, so clear these in whichever order you prefer. Let's talk about some classes you should be wary of early on enemies. Skirmishers should never be underestimated. They are tanky, deal solid damage, and they have poison, bleeding, and a bunch of disables, so they make a scary combo with pretty much every other class. The other rogue classes, Rogue, Marauder, and Shadowblade, are more manageable. They're considerably less tanky, but you should still be wary of them, especially if you're playing a light armor character, as they can deal high damage in melee, and they only need to get lucky with some crits once for your run to end. Brawlers are a similar story. Oozemancers are then the kings of being annoying. They're extremely tanky and difficult to fight, since you really don't want to stand next to them in their mucus, which will stack up poison on you quickly. They are often a key ingredient in the really nasty enemies. Summoners can be surprisingly terrifying early on. The rich Flamespitter especially hits really hard. You should never try to just face tank it. If you can't quickly get close to the summoner, don't fight. Kite them around the corner, as they die very easily without their summons. Also, in general, you should respect all the classes that have long-range spells and attacks, as you might not have great ways of closing the gap early. You can let them come to you, or if they're static, like this plant, you can sometimes dig around them. There's a few more situations I want to highlight, about how your mindset should change from Nightmare. First one happened in the caves. I'm fighting this Cultist of Entropy Necromancer unique, and I've managed to bring it really low. It's 80 health, away from dying. So if I just bump into it, or use my stunning blow, it probably dies. It doesn't even have any defense. But you'll notice I'm surrounded by skeletons, I've got a bunch of debuffs on me, and most importantly, I am pinned for 7 turns. There's also a Nether Blast flying at me, and my strongest talents are currently on cooldown. What I decide to do here is I cleanse the pin, while I don't have more physical debuffs, so that I can target it, and I run away with my Movement Infusion. Then I slowly clear out the skeletons, and come back and easily finish off the unique. And look, I probably had a 99% chance of being fine if I just stayed there and fought, but things can go wrong incredibly quickly on Insane. You need to condition yourself to frequently just run away and reset. I was mostly spooked by the 7-turn pin, because that's how a lot of early deaths look like. Long disables should never be underestimated, especially in the early game with limited ability of cleansing debuffs. You never want to have to rely on luck to get out. Here's another example. I'm fighting a Berserker Doomed unique snake when a Vermic Marauder bear suddenly starts running at me. I stun the snake, hoping to maybe quickly burst it before the bear comes closer, but as soon as it closes the gap, I'm just running. Again, could I win that fight? Yeah, maybe, but why, if I can instead guarantee winning that fight? I found this to be the biggest difference between Nightmare and Insane, especially in the early game. You get very swiftly punished for overconfidence. You might not get the chance to go, okay, maybe I should be more careful next time. But obviously I could talk about this for hours, and yet everyone will still sometimes misjudge the situation. The best way to learn in Tome is, unfortunately, the hard way. To die and learn from it, and die and learn, and die and learn. But hopefully this helps you speedrun that process a little bit. Alright, let's talk about vaults. You come upon these fairly frequently throughout the entire game, and you might have heard people in the community say that maybe you should just skip them, that the reward is rarely worth it. And it's true, but if you're like me, it's not really a choice. I simply need to open those vaults. This is something that I kept from the time I played on Nightmare. I've not been broken yet, and that's mostly because the vaults are rarely that dangerous. Still, you should take some precautions. I always fully clear the level before opening them, so that I have an easier time running away if things do go wrong. You should also pre-buff or shield if you can. Definitely don't rush in. I respect it. The mobs in the vaults are much higher level. Play them slow, pull out enemies one by one, don't get surrounded, all the usual stuff, and you should be okay. You can absolutely skip them though. You won't be missing the gear or the experience on Insane. Ever. Opening chests is a similar story. Usually fairly easy, and I always open them. But again, clear the level first, or at least the immediate area, so that you can run away. The chests have a different color on the map, so you can easily identify them once the level is clear. If you own the Forbidden Cults expansion, you'll also find digestive sacks. These have broken me. I'm never opening one ever again. They spawn disgustingly powerful monsters, and if the RNG hits the right combination of classes, it's a problem. You can still usually just run away, like with the chests, but I only recommend opening them if you wish to better understand my feelings. Alright, so now we've done every tier 1 dungeon, but the Heart of the Gloom. You should have enough gold by now to buy good inscriptions, maybe some decent gear if you couldn't find it. Shops get new items every 10 levels, so make sure to check. If you find a Quartz during your adventures, make sure to save it, as the mages can make a pretty decent ring out of it with a bunch of stun immunity. Also about traveling on the world map, you want to avoid adventurer parties and Zigger patrols at all costs. These fights are run-enders for the entire game. If you do get caught, you can either try and fight if it's possible to aggro the enemies one by one, or if not, pop your Movement Infusion and run for the exit, as the zones are always very small. Obviously, if they manage to tag you with something that prevents leaving, you're dead, but often it's your best chance. Alright, so what's the deal with the Heart of the Gloom? Well, it's this. There's usually a huge open room in the center of each floor, and it's not unusual to have the entrance spawn there. This can be absolutely deadly, depending on the enemies that spawn in the room. I was pretty lucky here, because 2 of the rares and the unique are rats, which always have very low HP, so it wasn't a problem. But I've had runs where there are some Summoner Oozemancer plants sitting behind Rogue Berserker bears, and at that point you need to carefully decide what you want to do. Because if you go in, you won't be able to change your mind, as on Insane, you cannot change zones for 5 turns after you kill an enemy, and there will always be a random rat with an HP that will just die. You should be pretty overleveled at this point, but still, if it's looking even a little suspicious, just come back 10 levels later or skip it entirely. Again, on Insane you will hit level 50 a long time before the final boss, so you never have to worry about experience. Now obviously, if you don't enter through this big center room, this dungeon shouldn't really be much more difficult than the other ones, as you can just aggro enemies one by one when you get to the center. And there you go, you've done it! Tier 1 dungeons are behind you, maybe you're even starting to feel pretty strong. Is Insane really that much more difficult than Nightmare? Well, enter the first Tier 2 dungeon. Once you start consistently getting through the very early game, this is where you will probably start hitting the next brick wall. You can pick your poison. The Sandworm Lair is by far the most stressful, claustrophobic zone in the entire game. Daikara has a bunch of long-range hard-hitting enemies, and the Old Forest is okay, I guess, but I personally like starting with the maze. Your first few floors will be crucial. There is a noticeable difficulty jump from tier 1s, things are tankier and hit way harder. The good news is, you will also start finding much more powerful items, but you need to survive to get to them. This difficulty jump later repeats once you transition to tier 3s, but your character should be a lot more complete at that point, so it should go a lot smoother. I had a pretty close call against this Necromancer rare, where I decided to just stand still in its AoE, which kept blinding me. I was hoping to quickly kill it, but then I got dropped to around half HP, which is where I definitely should have used my healing inscription and backed away. Instead, I stood there for another turn, confidently casting a spell that removes a debuff from me every turn, and I got dropped below the comfortable HP threshold, panicked a bit, and tried to remove the blind with my Wild Infusion, forgetting this specific blind is a magical debuff, so I had to blindly Movement Infusion and back away. Very, very stupid of me, but thankfully I managed to stabilize, even though I even somehow got ambushed by a summoner. The final floor of Maze will have the boss instantly aggro on you when you enter. Unfortunately for me, the alternate layout doesn't have stairs. You instead have to jump down cracks in the floor, which means you can't get back up. This is mildly unsettling, but I managed the boss with a little trouble. But the boss was far from the scariest enemy on this floor. This is one thing that can happen in tier 1s, but happens way more often in tier 2s. You might encounter basically unkillable uniques. I ran into this Marauder Sun Paladin, which is fine, definitely not the scariest combo, but equally as important is the base type of these uniques. This little guy was a Void Horror, which are immune to stun, confusion, bleed, fear, blind, and silence. Not something you want to see on an enemy. I tried a few times, but it became pretty clear to me that it was just not dying fast enough. A lot of time this is okay, as you can just chunk the enemy, disengage, chunk them again, and so on until they die, but if they also have healing, like this Void Terror, it's a real pain. Thankfully, it wasn't very mobile, so I could easily kite it around, and eventually, realizing it's futile, I teleported out with my Rod of Recall. Feeling satisfied with surviving that, and thinking of the annoying way the alternate maze layout works, I decided to make the responsible decision and simply skip the rest of the floor. Just kidding. Of course I went back. Before teleporting, I successfully managed to kite the Void Horror away from the entrance so that I could explore the rest of the level without immediately aggroing it again. And it was going great. Until I ran into this. The dreaded Gunsnake. With my first attack, I dropped it to 55% HP and slowed it by 46%, and I thought to myself, this whole Gunsnake thing is a little over-exaggerated, isn't it? He always dies so quickly and doesn't really do all that much. So I bumped into it, and promptly decided that I've had enough of the maze and that I'm going to be evacuating. Just kidding. Of course I tried to fight it again. Remember that whole talk I did about not taking stupid risks? Yeah, we're far past that at this point. This was basically just actively trying to die. So I ran back, only to realize, wait a second, I don't have anywhere to run. I didn't explore the southern tunnels, and the Void Horror is waiting somewhere on the left. Thankfully though, I managed to slip past the Gunsnake and teleport out, for good this time. Alright, we're nearing the first Prodigy point, a huge power spike for any character, which should help you stabilize, but before that, there's one more big challenge. The Sandworm Lair. This is a zone where you really want to go and kill the boss because it gives you 3 stat points, a class point and a general point, basically a free extra level. At the same time, it's also a zone where it's impossible to run away from a fight because the tunnels keep collapsing. If you get the alternate layout, it's even worse and you kind of just have to fight your way through it. On the regular layout though, there are ways that you can make this easier for yourself. First off, let's make it clear. The goal of going to the Sandworm Lair is to kill the boss on the final floor, pick up its heart, and get out. Nothing else matters here. I don't open any chests, I try to fight as little as possible, just locate the exit and move to the next floor. Sometimes this is really easy, and the exit can even spawn right next to the entrance, but usually you'll have to do some exploring. Another important thing is to always know whether you're standing on a safe tile. When you hover over a tile, the ones that just say sand are safe, the ones that say unstable sand tunnel are not safe. Resting on those is a bad time. You should always start each floor by just standing still for a while. There will always be some sandworm tunnelers that will instantly aggro to you. Once you dispatch all of them, it's time to take one of the tunnels to the next room. But only to take a quick glimpse. Make sure you have enough time to run back into your original room. You will get a feel for this with experience, and don't be afraid to use your Movement Infusion for this. If you can spot any rares or uniques during your glimpse, it's perfect, because they will start brainlessly running at you and often die in the collapsing tunnels, which will suffocate them. You can be sure they died because of your XP going up, a message appearing in chat, and sometimes seeing a loot appear in the fog of war. If a tunnel is too long, you should abandon this strategy because you really don't want to aggro the enemies and run back only for the tunnel to close in front of you. This means you die. Or do you? There is one item I really like having when going to the Sandworm Lair, a Belt of Unlife. This is a rare belt only mod that makes you become undead while wearing it, making it so you no longer have to breathe. This becomes your last resort for this zone. If everything goes wrong and you're completely out of options, you can run into a tunnel, equip this belt and attempt to teleport out. If you have enough life to survive the tunnel collapse, you won't suffocate since you're undead, but all the enemies chasing you will. Now I've never actually had to use this strategy before, because I think I've become pretty good at managing this zone, but it should work and potentially save you. I almost made it work on this character, a Thalor Cursed. A couple of turns ago I walked into a room of death in an out-of-screen room in the top left, and the tunnel behind me closed, so I was forced to retreat through a different tunnel into an unexplored room, which fortunately only had a single rare. Unfortunately, all the enemies from the first room managed to follow me, and I was dying very quickly. This was it, the perfect chance to equip my Belt of Unlife. What I failed to realize is that it is an arcane mod, and my character was anti-magic, so a bit unfortunate. But you can see the idea here. I'm pretty sure I would have survived if I could have stayed further away and let myself get buried earlier. The belt of unlife can either drop, or usually I get it from a shop since every town sells belts. There's another, perhaps unintuitive strategy. Instead of following the worms as they dig a new tunnel, you can instead try going through an already fully dug out tunnel. This has the advantage of being completely safe from getting buried, as you can always simply walk back into the original room. It's a good way to safely scout rooms, and works even better if you have track. That's all the tools I know of and use to get through this hell. You should very rarely just have to blindly follow a worm into an unexplored room. Make sure you can't maybe go back to an already explored room and scout in a different direction first. If you manage to get to the boss, it shouldn't be too challenging unless she ambushes you while you're dealing with some other enemies. I usually go to the Old Forest third and Daikara last, but it doesn't matter much. If you are not already level 25, you will hit it very shortly in your third tier 2 dungeon. The Prodigy should make your life a lot easier. Whether it's a defensive or offensive one, it should have a noticeable impact. And there you go. On quite a lot of characters, you survived the hardest part of the game at this point. The rest definitely won't be easy, but I believe in you. There is one last life-saving tip I want to share. After level 25, you'll encounter an entrance to the Dark Crypt. This is your one and only chance to enter this dungeon, and I very strongly recommend against it. It's a bit like Heart of the Gloom, only instead of you, the monsters are the ones really overleveled, and instead of rats, it's blood mages and cultists. Look, I tried, okay? Like you, I was used to just full clearing every single dungeon on Nightmare. But then, I lost 3 characters in a row to the Dark Crypt, and it finally made me understand. The rules on Insane are just different. I know you are going to the Dark Crypt anyways, and that's great, it's the best way to learn. But for everyone else, unless you're going for achievements or the Bloodspring Prodigy for whatever reason, there's nothing important in the Dark Crypt, and the danger is colossal. Also, if you have the Forbidden Cults expansion, use the Rod of Recall. And that's all for this video. Good luck.